Thank you very much. Thanks again to Sal, Alex, and Christian for this opportunity. So lots of stuff about ACS and biomarkers earlier, a little shock now. We're going to talk about heart failure, and specifically a strategy in heart failure management, I think, that is probably flawed, that happens all over the world. So we're going to talk a little bit about the current recommendations for observing the response to oral diuretics. So you admit someone with heart failure, they get 3 or 4 days of IV diuretics, and you do this thing where you switch them to oral diuretics and you watch them, and you see how they do, and you decide if they're ready to go home based on how they respond. What does the evidence suggest we should do, and how does this impact your practice? So the current guideline recommendations are very loose. Level of evidence C. The ESC guidelines from recent ones say after IV therapy for heart failure, treatment should be optimized before discharge. Doesn't really recommend oral diuretics, doesn't really recommend observation. ACC is probably even worse. Patients often need diuretic up titration after discharge. What does that mean? I should see them soon after I discharge them, right? The only one that really puts their foot down is the heart failure consensus pathway published by the ACC. And they actually say verifying oral diuretic effectiveness generally requires at least 24 hours of observation. Stop IV diuretics, start orals, watch them for 24 hours. That's what they recommend. They reference the ACC guidelines from 2013 in one observational study of 123 patients. So very weak evidence. So I would suggest there's a lot of equipoise regarding the impact of the observation on diuretics. The current data suggests this happens in 50% of patients. So we flip a coin. Half the time I keep them for 24 hours of observation, half the time I just give them a prescription and send them home. There is no correlation to hospital size, geographic location, urban versus rural, teaching versus non-teaching. There is complete equipoise. It is very random as to whether someone gets kept in the hospital or not. And the practice is actually quite variable based on whether you're a cardiologist or a hospitalist. Actually, some of the data suggests hospitalists keep patients in the hospital longer to observe them on diuretics. But importantly, there's no difference in 30-day readmission. So whether you keep them or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is after they leave the hospital. So if we shorten this, at least in the US, shorten a hospitalization by 1 day, send a patient home earlier with a prescription, don't watch them on their oral diuretic, costs $2,500 US per day. There's 1 million hospitalizations. That's greater than $2 billion saved. I think we could put that somewhere else. Okay, so what do I think are my 4 keys to success? So let's make the assumption that observation on diuretic works. Okay, you keep them in the hospital, give them a pill, and watch them. 4 things have to occur. First of all, the response that you see must reflect what you're going to see in 7 days in the outpatient setting. Secondly, the response you see in the hospital must be quantifiable. So urine output, weight change, net negative, it must be quantifiable, right? Thirdly, the provider must act on this data and must act on it in the right way. And then fourthly, if you're going to keep them in the hospital and spend an extra $2,500, it sure better change their outcome. So instead of calling these keys, I'm going to call them myths, okay? Myth number 1 is that your response in the hospital reflects your outpatient response. It doesn't, actually. We've studied this. So we actually, an older study looked at just the difference between being supine and giving you a pill versus up walking around ambulatory as an outpatient. Nearly a doubling of your diuretic response. So 75 millimoles of sodium is not very good response when you're ambulatory. It's really good when you're lying on your back in the hospital. Same dose of diuretic, but much different response, probably due to renin activation, renin-angiotensin system, et cetera. Okay? How about if I give you a pill now, does it look like what the pill does in 7 days? Well, we did measured urine, 6-hour urine collection. We gave you your 40 milligrams of furosemide during your hospitalization. We did the same test on you 7 days later. There should be a nice line up the middle here showing that your outpatient and inpatient response look the same. You can see it's like spaghetti. It's a complete scatter plot, right? The R squared is 0.07. So only 7% of your response as an outpatient is explained by your inpatient response. That ain't very good, right? So myth number 2, not key number 2, myth number 2 is that it's easily quantifiable. I give you a pill and I can quantify how you respond, right? I don't know about you, but where I practice, urine output is like a random number generator. Every day you show up and look in the chart, it was 800, it's 1,500, it's not documented, right? It's horribly documented. fluid balance and weight change, as you can see from this graph, don't correlate very well. If you lose a liter of fluid, you should lose about 2 pounds or a kilogram, right? It rarely correlates. And importantly, neither of these two outcomes, or neither of these two data points are associated with heart failure outcomes. This is the key slide. So let's say this works and I can collect the urine really well and the weights really well. The providers have to act on it, okay? And so here's what we would expect. If you lose weight, if you're net negative or you have great urine output, I would expect that you would decrease the dose. So I give you a pill, I watch you for 24 hours, and 24 hours later I look at 3 data points: weight loss, net negative fluid loss, and urine output. And if you lost weight, dose should go down. If your weight stayed neutral, which is what you want in the outpatient setting, the dose should be the gray bar. It should stay the same. And if your weight goes up, I would increase your dose because you're not responding appropriately. Let's take something very simple like weight gained. You can see here, 75% of the time when patients gained weight in the hospital, we just published this in Circ Heart Failure, the provider decreased the dose, right? 75% of the time they had a net positive, so they actually had more in than out. Provider decreased the dose. This makes no sense whatsoever. Why am I keeping them in the hospital if I'm not following the data? Well, I think because weight loss and net fluid loss go in different directions and the provider's confused the next morning, right? They've also never correlated with outcomes. And what probably happens is they come in the next morning and they say, you know what, I don't know what data to believe. What were you on when you came into the hospital? That's what I'm going to discharge you on, right? They just default to whatever the admission dose was. So not good data. And then most importantly, if I'm going to do all this stuff, I have to make a difference in outcomes, right? We looked at 18,000 hospitalizations, over 10,000 patients. Half of the patients received observation. No difference. There's actually 2 lines there. It looks like only 1 line, but they're so superimposed, the Cox survival curves, there's 2 lines. No difference in 30-day outcomes. Okay, so next steps, I think this data strongly suggests that observing people spending billions of dollars, wasting an extra day in the hospital doesn't do anything, but we don't know for sure. The level of evidence is horrible. We need a strategy trial in people who are ready for discharge that randomizes them to observing them for 24 hours on their home dose or sending them home with a prescription. Following everybody up early, but we hypothesize that the strategy won't be any better than discharging them directly when it comes to 30-day all-cause death, rehospitalization, et cetera. And we should shift this money to getting them a ride to their outpatient appointment, paying for their medications, maybe doing some testing on them or in the outpatient setting, rather than spending that money in the hospital. At a very minimum, that trial would inform the guidelines, right? I showed you before. It's level C evidence. We'd have level A evidence. Now, whether it works or not is another question, right? If observing people is non-inferior to just sending them home, we need to do something else. Send them home and try something else. If it's superior, watching them in the hospital, then maybe we can replace it with something else. So rather than looking at this bad weight change and net negative fluid data, maybe we could look at something very simple, like their urine sodium. We've looked at this in a large number of people, and you can see here, I get your spot urine sodium and creatinine 2 hours after I give you a dose of diuretic, and I know exactly how much you're going to put out the next 6 hours with very high AUCs. This is for IV diuretics. This is for oral diuretics. I can really predict whether you're going to respond or not. Give you your pill, have you pee, 2 hours later measure your urine sodium and urine creatinine, and have a very good measure of whether I'm over or under, right? And our data suggests that we're very good at identifying a brisk response versus a horrible response and adjusting your diuretics on the same day before you go home using this equation. And in fact, of all the variables we think about at the end of the hospitalization that we adjust our diuretics on, if we use the urine sodium and creatinine, the area under the curve, now lots of bumps in these lines because very small number of patients. But area under the curve is much better than did their Lasix dose predict their response, right? The Lasix dose was a flip of the coin. Looking at actual response metrics like urine sodium and creatinine, I think is where we need to go. So conclusions, there's really no rigorous data to support this practice that's really quite haphazard and suggests that we don't even use the data when we keep them in the hospital. It's likely highly flawed because these patients have had days of IV diuretics. Their kidneys are used to seeing IV diuretics. They may have some AKI. They're not eating 4 bags of potato chips in the hospital. And there's just many reasons to think why it wouldn't work to watch them. Equipoise suggests that we really need a strategy trial to answer this question, to inform the guidelines and figure out what we should be doing at the end of a stay. And I think we should probably shift our cost from the costly inpatient setting to the outpatient setting, where early follow-up, paying for medications, and adjusting guideline-directed medical therapy is what's going to make the most difference. Thank you.
Thank you for this excellent talk. I've seen there's questions from the audience. Sal?
Thank you, Sean. This is a very important issue for people working in the emergency room. We have to find a solution for overcrowding, and this is one solution. I just would like to share with you my hypothesis. I fully agree with your concept to have this 24 hours observation even in the emergency room, right? You can do this. I'm just wondering if you can add 2 things in the future on this message. First of all, why don't we also, beside the sodium excretion, to measure natriuretic peptide 24 hours later? Because this is many evidence that if ever reach some decrease, so it should be good, just to make more sure there is some kind of volume depletion. And what about telemedicine program? Mm-hmm. Because we are now, I'm working in the government of Italy to support a lot early discharge and telemonitoring. Because the patient you mentioned is coming back.
Correct.
You can, control by nurse station.
Right. Yeah, actually, you bring up a great point. So first, natriuretic peptides, yes. I think at the time of discharge, a lower natriuretic peptide is prognostic for a better prognosis, right? The change in natriuretic peptides is a little challenging. But your second question, telemedicine, our strategies can be done in the house. And so we have this thing in the United States called hospital at home. So that person who spends 24 hours in my emergency room, the team comes down and sees them and says they don't need to be admitted to the hospital. We'll send them home. We'll have a nurse come out and see them, give them a dose of IV diuretic, draw their blood, check on them again tomorrow, take their vital signs, et cetera. So that is exactly where we need to go, especially in these lower risk patients who aren't going to do poorly, but have 10 or 15 pounds of volume that need to be pulled off. Doesn't necessarily need to be in the hospital. Agree.
More questions from the audience? I have one question. So you mentioned several parameters that can be measured to measure a diuretic response. What about the patient's subjective improvement? Can this improve our discharge planning or disposition planning?
Yeah, I think during IV diuresis, that's really important, right? Do they still have orthopnea? How are they feeling? Can they get around the room? The challenge with it, when you're done with IV diuretics, 90% of those symptoms are gone, and you're just trying to maintain euvolemia, right? Not more out than more in. And so symptoms are less, and that's what's part of the challenge, right? Doc, I want to go home. I feel like I did yesterday. Why am I still here? You know, it's Friday. I want to be home for the weekend. So that's the tension and the tethering that we encounter.
Okay. There's one last question.
Sean, thank you very much for this nice presentation. I will speak about the markers of renal function in this project, about creatinine. Creatinine is a late marker of renal worsening. Possibly new biomarker like PENP1 is more sensitive in order to adapt the diuretic dose, especially from emergency department, in order to avoid overdiuresis or to avoid ineffective decongestion in these patients. What is your opinion about that? At 1 second is to follow these patients also for decongestion with lung ultrasound, because there are some trials now for observation in emergency department, 24 hours before and after lung ultrasound for resolution of B lines.
Yes, I like your thinking. So we've sort of come full circle on the kidney, right? We initially thought, like, if you diurese someone and their creatinine bumps, it's bad. There's now really good data suggesting small bumps are what you want. It probably suggests efficient decongestion, and renal tubular injury markers don't go up in that situation. But when you truly get AKI, it's a problem. I agree. So kidney function is important. Lung ultrasound, I love it. I think it's probably a better dynamic marker of congestion than natriuretic peptides are, because things move much quicker, and especially between beginning of treatment and end of treatment, whether that's in the ER or the hospital, I think it's a good tool.
And I've read a paper recently in that was demonstrated that patients were able to measure B lines appropriately as well. So maybe
On their home-
the patient can contribute in the end.
Even better for more telemedicine, like Sal said, home health, right? Great. Thank you.